"Clean my shoe," he said, not looking at her, like the sentence had been used too many times to deserve eye contact, like it belonged more to the room than to him. And the room obeyed, falling into that strange, polished silence that only expensive places could afford, where even the air seemed filtered and disciplined, where a single word from a man like Richard Sterling could weigh more than a contract worth $50 million. Maya Carter stood still for half a second longer than expected, her gloved hand wrapped around the damp handle of a mop, the faint scent of industrial cleaner rising into the cold, glass-lit conference room, her reflection bending across the marble floor in broken fragments as the overhead lights cut sharp lines across it. And in that reflection, she could see him. Tailored suit, silver watch, posture carved from certainty, waiting without waiting, expecting without needing to say it twice. Someone at the far end of the table shifted in their seat. Another cleared their throat quietly, but no one spoke, because no one ever spoke when Richard Sterling decided the tone of the room. Maya lowered her eyes, not in submission, but in calculation, and stepped forward, the soft squeak of her worn sneakers almost too loud against the polished surface, her bucket rolling slightly behind her, water inside it trembling in small ripples like it understood something was about to break. She reached his side, stopping just short of his extended shoe, the leather. Flawless except for a faint smudge near the toe, something most people wouldn't notice, something he clearly had, and for a moment, the entire world narrowed to that tiny imperfection, that speck that had summoned her into his orbit. Richard exhaled slowly, impatient but controlled, his fingers tapping once against the table, a subtle signal, a rhythm of authority, and still he didn't look at her. Maya noticed that too. The way power sometimes avoided eye contact, not out of fear, but out of habit, as if acknowledging someone like her required more effort than it was worth. She bent slightly, not enough to kneel, just enough to bring the cloth in her hand closer to the shoe. And in the glossy curve of the leather, she saw the distorted reflection of the room. The executives, the documents, the open folder near his elbow, one page slightly out of alignment, just enough to catch her attention again. The same page she had seen earlier while emptying the trash. The same page that hadn't sat right in her mind no matter how many times she tried to ignore it. "You missed a spot," he added, quieter now, almost bored, as if repeating himself was beneath him but necessary, and a faint chuckle slipped from someone near the middle of the table before being quickly swallowed. Maya paused, cloth hovering an inch from the leather, her breath steady, her heartbeat not racing, but measured, deliberate, like she had already decided something long before this moment arrived. The light from the floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across her hands, highlighting the small creases in her gloves, the faint tremor in the water behind her, the stillness in her shoulders. She didn't move, not yet, because somewhere between the smell of bleach and the hum of central air, between the weight of his words and the silence of everyone watching, something shifted, not loud, not visible, just enough to be felt, like a current beneath calm water. And for the first time since she entered the room, Maya Carter didn't see a billionaire in front of her. She saw a man about to make a mistake he wouldn't be able to undo. And the realization settled quietly in her chest, heavy but certain, as her grip on the cloth loosened just slightly, and instead of lowering it to his shoe, she lifted her gaze, just a fraction, enough to meet the edge of his reflection in the leather, enough to choose what came next. The cloth never touched the shoe, and that was the first thing that felt wrong to everyone watching, not because it was dramatic, but because it was subtle, because it broke a pattern that had never needed to be spoken out loud. Richard noticed it too, not immediately, but in the way his fingers stopped tapping, in the way the silence stretched just a fraction longer than it should have, and for the first time, he shifted his gaze downward, not fully meeting her eyes, but enough to acknowledge that something had changed. Maya straightened slowly, the movement controlled, deliberate, her posture no longer bent toward the floor but aligned with the room, and the reflection in the polished marble floor adjusted with her, no longer fragmented, but steady. The bucket behind her gave a soft, hollow sound as the water settled, and in that quiet, she spoke, her voice calm, not loud, not defiant, just clear enough to cut through the air without force. "Sir, you might want to take another look at the contract before you sign it." The words did not echo, but they lingered, like a note that refused to fade, And for a moment, no one reacted, because no one expected a cleaner to interrupt a meeting that had taken weeks to arrange, because no one expected that tone to come from someone holding a mop. A man near the end of the table let out a short breath, almost a laugh, quickly disguised as a cough, while another leaned back slightly, exchanging a glance with his colleague that said everything without a word. And yet Richard did not respond right away. Instead, he studied the space in front of him, the open folder, the page that had been slightly out of place, the pen resting between his fingers. And then, finally, he looked at her, fully this time, his expression not angry, not yet, but sharpened by curiosity edged with disbelief. "Excuse me," he said, his tone controlled, measured, the kind that did not need volume to carry authority. Maya did not step back, did not lower her gaze, and that alone shifted something again, subtle but undeniable, as she nodded once, not in apology, but in confirmation. "There is a clause on page 17, subsection C. It shifts all post-merger liability to your company, not the partner firm. It looks standard, but it is not." The room did not freeze all at once. It unraveled into stillness piece by piece. One executive reaching for the document, another tilting their screen closer, the faint sound of pages turning replacing the earlier silence. And Richard's jaw tightened just slightly as he flipped the page himself, his movements precise, practiced, but now carrying a different weight. "And you know this how?" he asked, not looking up from the document, his voice quieter now, but sharper, as if testing the boundaries of what he was willing to entertain. Maya's hands remained steady at her sides, the damp cloth hanging loosely from her fingers. "Because it is written to be overlooked," she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no trace of doubt, only a calm certainty that did not match the uniform she wore. Someone across the table leaned forward, scanning the text more closely, their brow furrowing as their finger traced a line that had seemed invisible moments ago. And another voice, softer, uncertain, broke through. "He is right. It is there." The correction came quickly, almost instinctively, but it did not erase the shift that had already begun, and Richard's pen, still poised above the signature line, did not move, his eyes fixed on the clause, the words that had been designed to blend in now standing out with uncomfortable clarity. And for the first time since the meeting began, the authority in the room did not feel absolute. It felt suspended, waiting, as if everything now depended on whether he would continue as planned or acknowledge the interruption that should not have mattered, but suddenly did. No one spoke for a few seconds after that, not because they did not want to, but because the room had shifted into something unfamiliar, something quieter than authority and heavier than doubt. And Richard Sterling felt it before he acknowledged it, a subtle pressure behind his ribs, the kind that came when certainty began to crack. His eyes moved across the clause again, slower this time, tracing each line not as a formality, but as a calculation, and the words that once looked routine now carried weight, each phrase leaning in a direction he had not noticed before, each sentence structured with just enough ambiguity to pass through a rushed review. And that realization settled into him with a quiet, unwelcome clarity. Across the table, one of the senior analysts adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to his screen, scrolling, checking, rechecking, his earlier confidence replaced with something tighter, more cautious, while another executive shifted in his chair, the leather creaking softly, his expression no longer composed but strained at the edges. Richard finally set the pen down, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough for the faint click against the table to register. And that sound carried farther than any raised voice could have, because it marked a pause in a decision that had seemed inevitable moments ago. He lifted his head again, this time fully, his gaze locking onto Maya with a focus that was no longer dismissive, but searching, measuring, as if trying to reconcile the person standing in front of him with the interruption she had created. "You are telling me," he said slowly, choosing each word with care, "that this entire agreement is structured to transfer risk to my company without clear disclosure." Maya nodded once, her expression steady, her voice just as controlled as before. "Yes, sir, it is written to appear balanced, but the liability language is one-sided. And if anything goes wrong after the merger, your firm absorbs the consequences while theirs walks away protected." A quiet murmur moved through the room, not loud enough to disrupt, but enough to signal that the realization was spreading, piece by piece, from one person to another, and Richard's gaze did not leave her. "And you caught this?" he continued, his tone shifting again, less dismissive now, more deliberate. While cleaning the room, there was a hint of disbelief in the question, not aggressive, but probing, as if the explanation itself needed to justify the disruption. Maya did not hesitate. The document was left open on the table earlier. I read what I could while finishing my shift, and something did not feel right. So I looked closer. She did not elaborate beyond that, did not mention how quickly her eyes had moved across the text, how instinct had guided her to the clause that mattered, how familiarity had surfaced where it should not have, and that restraint made her words land heavier, not lighter. Richard studied her for a moment longer. The silence between them no longer filled with dismissal, but with evaluation, and then he glanced back down at the contract, flipping another page, then another, his movements slower now, more careful, as if every line might hold something he had missed. The deal, the room, the expectations that had built around this moment, all of it hovered in place, waiting for him to either dismiss what she had said or accept the possibility that the most important voice in the room had not come from the people seated at the table, but from the one person who was never meant to be heard at all. And as that thought settled in, the balance of power did not collapse. It tilted, just enough to make everyone feel it, even if no one was ready to admit it yet. The room did not return to normal after that. It settled into something thinner, like the air had been stretched too far and might tear if anyone spoke too quickly, and Richard could feel every pair of eyes shifting between him and the document in front of him, waiting for a decision that no longer felt routine. He flipped back to the clause again, slower now, reading not just the words but the intent behind them, the structure, the careful layering of language that disguised imbalance as protection, and the more he read, the more precise the discomfort became, like a pattern emerging where there should have been symmetry. Across the table, one of his legal advisors leaned forward, clearing his throat softly. "It could be interpreted that way," he said, the hesitation in his voice more revealing than the words themselves. And that was enough to push the tension one step further, because doubt from inside the room carried more weight than any interruption from outside it. Richard did not respond immediately, his jaw tightening slightly as he set both hands flat on the table, grounding himself in something solid while everything else felt less certain. And then he spoke again, quieter than before, but sharper. "Why was this not flagged during review?" The question did not target anyone directly, but it landed on everyone, and no one answered right away, because no answer would sound sufficient in a moment like this. A senior partner adjusted his tie, avoiding eye contact, while another executive scrolled through their tablet with unnecessary urgency, searching for something that should have already been found. Maya remained where she stood, not stepping forward, not stepping back, her presence no longer disruptive but anchored, as if the room had reorganized itself around the fact that she was still there. Richard glanced at her again, briefly this time, not with dismissal, but with something closer to recognition, then back to the document, flipping one more page, then another, his movements methodical, as if he were recalibrating his understanding in real time. "If this is intentional," he said slowly, almost to himself, "then it is not just a bad clause. It is a calculated risk transfer." And the words settled heavily across the table, because they reframed the situation from oversight to strategy, from mistake to design. One of the analysts nodded faintly. "It aligns with their previous structures," he added, more confidently now, as if the pattern had become visible to him too. And that confirmation closed the gap between suspicion and reality. Richard leaned back slightly, the leather chair absorbing the movement, his eyes fixed on the contract but no longer reading it, processing instead, measuring the cost of what had almost happened, not in numbers, but in consequence, in control, in reputation, and for a brief moment, the authority he carried felt less like certainty and more like responsibility. He exhaled slowly, then reached forward and closed the folder, the sound soft but final, and that single motion shifted the room again, not into chaos, but into a new kind of stillness, one that acknowledged something had been avoided, even if no one said it out loud. His gaze lifted once more, not to the executives, not to the advisors, but to Maya, standing there with a damp cloth in her hand and a quiet steadiness that did not match the role she had been assigned. And for the first time, the question forming in his mind was not about the contract, but about her, about how someone who was never meant to be part of. The conversation had become the reason it did not end in a mistake. The folder remained closed in front of Richard, but the weight of it did not disappear. It shifted, settling somewhere deeper, somewhere less visible, but far more permanent. And for a moment he did not move, as if the decision he had just made needed to be understood before anything else could happen. Around the table, no one reached for their notes. No one resumed their talking points, because the rhythm of the meeting had been broken in a way that could not simply be restarted, and the silence now carried acknowledgement, quiet and uneasy, that something important had been caught just in time. Richard's hand rested lightly on the cover of the contract, his fingers still, no longer tapping, no longer signaling impatience. And when he finally spoke again, his voice had changed, not softer, not weaker, but measured in a way that suggested he was no longer performing authority, he was using it. "We are not signing this today," he said, and the statement did not need emphasis. It landed with certainty on its own, spreading across the table in a wave of subtle reactions. A slight exhale here, a tightened jaw there, a glance exchanged between partners who understood exactly what had just been avoided. One of the executives nodded quickly, almost relieved, while another sat back, absorbing the shift with a slower, more cautious acceptance. But no one challenged the decision, because the foundation beneath it had already been exposed. Richard opened the folder again, not to continue the process, but to mark the place, sliding a single page slightly forward as if isolating the problem. Then he pushed the entire document aside, clearing space in front of him, and that small gesture created a visual line in the room, before and after, what was planned and what would now be reconsidered. His gaze lifted once more, steady, direct, and this time it did not move past Maya. It stopped on her, fully, as if for the first time he was seeing her not as part of the background, but as part of the moment. "What is your name?" he asked, the question simple, but placed with intention, and the room felt it. The shift from dismissal to recognition, subtle but undeniable. Maya adjusted her grip on the cloth. Slightly, not out of nervousness, but out of habit, grounding herself in something familiar, and answered without hesitation. "Maya Carter, sir." He nodded once, not exaggerated, not performative, just enough to acknowledge the answer, and then he leaned back again, studying her for a second longer than necessary, as if recalibrating something internal, something that had been assumed before and now needed to be reconsidered. "Maya," he repeated quietly, testing the name in a space where it had not been expected to matter, and then he asked, "Have you ever worked with contracts before?" The question did not carry accusation, it carried curiosity edged with something else, something closer to respect, though not fully formed yet. Maya held his gaze, her expression unchanged, her voice steady. "Yes, sir, not recently, but enough to recognize when something does not add up." She did not elaborate, did not fill the silence with explanations, and that restraint again made her presence feel larger than it should have, not louder, just more solid. Richard watched her for another moment, then glanced briefly around the table, at the advisors who had missed what she had caught, at the analysts who were now rechecking their work, and something in his posture shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to signal that the balance in the room had moved, not overturned, but adjusted. And as that realization settled, the role she had been assigned at the start of the meeting no longer fit the person standing in front of him, and everyone in the room, whether they admitted it or not, could feel that difference taking shape. Richard did not look away immediately after she answered, and that alone stretched the moment longer than anyone expected, because men like him were not known for pausing, they were known for deciding, and yet here he was, measuring something that could not be quantified on a spreadsheet or negotiated across a table. The light from the windows shifted slightly as a cloud passed outside, softening the sharp reflections across the marble floor, and in that muted glow, the contrast between them felt less defined by status and more by presence, by the way she stood without asking for space and the way he now allowed it. One of the advisors cleared his throat again, this time louder, as if trying to re-anchor the meeting back to its original course. Sir, we can have legal reevaluate and reschedule within 48 hours, he offered, his voice careful, eager to restore structure. But Richard did not respond to him right away, his attention still fixed on Maya. Not recently, he repeated quietly, echoing her words as if testing their weight. Then he leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, closing the distance not physically, but in focus. When was the last time you worked with something like this? The question carried more intention now, less curiosity and more pursuit, and the room felt it. The shift from interruption to inquiry. Maya glanced briefly at the folder he had pushed aside, then back at him, her expression unchanged, but something in her eyes reflected recognition, not of him, but of the question itself. A few years ago, she said, her voice even. Before I needed something more immediate, something that paid on time. She did not offer details, did not frame it as loss or hardship, just a fact placed gently between them, and that simplicity made it harder to dismiss. A faint movement rippled through the table, someone adjusting their chair, another tapping a pen that no longer wrote anything down, and Richard noticed it. Not the sound itself, but what it represented: distraction, discomfort, the subtle resistance of a room not used to shifting its hierarchy so quickly. He sat back again, slower this time, his hand moving to the edge of the folder, tapping it once, not out of impatience, but thought. And then he turned his head slightly toward his team, his voice steady, controlled, but carrying a new edge of accountability. I want a full review of every clause in this agreement by end of day, not just the highlighted sections, everything. The instruction landed clean, without hesitation, and this time the responses came quickly, nods, quiet. Affirmations, the machinery of the room reactivating under a different directive, one that had been triggered not from within, but from someone who was never supposed to influence it. When he looked back at Maya, the space between them felt different again, less defined by what she was supposed to be doing and more by what she had already done. You said you recognized it. He continued, his tone softer, but no less focused. That kind of structure is not obvious, not even to experienced analysts. Maya shifted her weight slightly, the bucket behind her rolling an inch before settling again, the faint sound echoing softly against the walls, grounding the moment back in reality. It is obvious, she said, not challenging, not defensive, just certain. If you know what to look for, and if you have seen it before. The statement hung there, simple, but layered, and for a brief moment, Richard did not respond. Not because he disagreed, but because he understood what it implied. That the knowledge in the room had not been enough, that the oversight had not been accidental, but habitual, a result of looking only where they expected value to be, and ignoring where it might actually appear. The realization did not embarrass him, it recalibrated him, and as he studied her again, the title he had assigned to her earlier no longer fit in his mind the same way. It felt incomplete, insufficient, and that awareness settled quietly between them, not spoken, but present, shaping what would come next. The room slowly resumed movement, but it was not the same movement as before. It was quieter, more deliberate, like every action now carried awareness that something important had almost been missed, and that awareness lingered in the way people handled their papers, in the way they avoided unnecessary comments, in the way their eyes occasionally drifted toward Maya, as if confirming she was still there. Richard noticed all of it without turning his head, the subtle recalibration of a room that had just been forced to reconsider its assumptions, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel in complete control of the narrative, not because he had lost authority, but because authority itself had been interrupted by something he had not anticipated. He tapped the edge of the table once, not sharply, just enough to draw the room back into focus, and the low hum of whispered exchanges faded almost instantly, replaced by a collective attention that returned to him. We will reconvene once the full review is complete, he said, his tone even, final, leaving no space for negotiation, and one by one, the executives began to gather their materials, the sound of folders closing and chairs shifting creating a soft, orderly exit from a meeting that had not ended the way anyone expected. As they stood, a few glanced again at Maya, not openly, not long enough to be obvious, but enough to acknowledge that the outcome of the meeting now carried her imprint, whether they were comfortable with it or not. Within minutes, the room emptied of its usual hierarchy, leaving behind only the quiet aftermath, the polished table, the abandoned reflections on the marble floor, and the faint scent of cleaner still hanging in the air like a reminder of what had been overlooked. Richard remained seated for a moment longer, his hand resting on the closed folder, his posture no longer rigid, but thoughtful, and when he finally stood, the movement was slower, more measured, as if he was stepping out of one version of the moment and into another. Maya had already turned slightly, instinct guiding her back toward the work she had been doing before the interruption, her hand reaching for the mop handle again, the routine waiting for her, as if nothing had changed, and for a second, it almost looked like it had not. The bucket rolled softly as she adjusted it, the water inside settling into small, quiet ripples, and she lowered the cloth back toward the floor, not toward his shoe this time, but toward the space that needed to be cleaned, the task she had been assigned, the role she was expected to return to. "Maya," Richard said, and the sound of her name in his voice stopped her before the cloth touched the surface, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to pause the motion. She straightened again, turning back toward him, her expression composed, unchanged, but the air between them felt different now, less defined by instruction and more by intention. He took a step closer, closing part of the distance that had once separated them by position rather than space. And for a brief moment, he looked at the mop, the bucket, the gloves, then back at her, as if acknowledging the contrast without commenting on it. "Do not go back to that just yet," he said, his tone calm, but carrying a quiet weight that suggested this was not a casual request. Maya held his gaze, her hand still resting on the handle, the damp cloth hanging loosely, and there was no resistance in her posture, only stillness. Waiting, Richard exhaled once, then continued. "I would like you to walk me through exactly what you saw, from the beginning, not as an interruption, but as part of this process." And the words settled between them, reshaping the moment in a way that neither of them needed to question, because it was clear now that whatever she had noticed was no longer outside the room, it was inside it, and for the first time, she was being asked to stand there not as someone who cleaned the edges of the conversation, but as someone who could define its direction. The room felt different now, not just quieter, but more focused, like the air itself had narrowed around the space between them, and Maya could feel it in the way the light from the windows no longer scattered across the floor, but settled in clean lines, sharp and deliberate, mirroring the attention now directed at her. She released the mop handle slowly, letting it rest against the edge of the bucket, the faint sound of plastic against metal grounding the moment, and stepped forward just enough to close the gap without crossing into his space, her movements measured, unhurried, as if she had already accepted the shift that everyone else was still adjusting to. Richard remained where he stood, his posture steady, his eyes fixed on her with a level of attention that did not waver, not the kind he used in negotiations or presentations, but something more precise, more intentional, as if he were listening before she even spoke. "Start from when you first saw it," he said, his voice calm, stripped of the earlier edge, and the request carried weight, not because of authority, but because of what it implied, that her perspective now mattered in a room where it never had. Maya nodded once, her gaze steady, and for a brief second, her eyes flicked toward the table, toward the folder that had been moved aside, as if tracing the path back to where it had begun. "It was earlier this morning," she said, her voice even, clear, the kind that did not need volume to carry. The documents were left open after the first meeting. Most of the pages were aligned, but one was slightly off, just enough to notice if you were not rushing. Richard followed her glance, his attention shifting briefly to the table, then back to her, absorbing not just the words, but the way she framed them, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just precise. "I was not looking for anything specific," she continued, but the language in that section stood out, not because it was obvious, but because it was too balanced, too clean, like it was written to avoid questions instead of invite them. The explanation settled into the space between them, and Richard's expression shifted slightly, not outwardly, but enough to show he understood the distinction. The difference between something being correct and something being designed to appear correct. Maya took another small breath, steady, controlled. So I read it again, slower. And then I noticed how the responsibility was structured. It did not remove risk, it redirected it, entirely. But in a way that would not trigger concern unless you were specifically looking for it. Richard's jaw tightened just slightly, not in frustration, but recognition. The kind that came when something hidden became clear too late, and yet not too late this time. And you were, he said quietly, not a question, but an acknowledgement. Maya held his gaze. I have seen that structure before, she said, and there was a subtle shift in her tone now, not defensive, not proud, just factual, but carrying history behind it. Richard tilted his head slightly, studying her more closely, as if trying to place that history without asking for it directly. And for a moment, the room felt smaller, more contained, like everything outside. This conversation had paused to let it unfold. The silence that followed was not empty. It was active, filled with understanding forming in real time. And in that stillness, the roles that had defined the beginning of the day no longer aligned with what stood in front of him now. Because the person who had walked into the room with a mop had just walked him through a mistake that could have cost him everything. And there was no way to return to the version of her that had existed before that. Realization took hold. Richard did not respond immediately after she said that, and the silence that followed was not hesitation. It was recognition taking shape, slow and deliberate, settling into him in a way that could not be ignored or brushed aside. And for the first time since the meeting began, he was not thinking about the deal, or the numbers, or the timeline. He was thinking about the gap, the space between what should have been seen and what had been missed, and how the person who noticed it was never supposed to be in that position at all. He shifted his weight slightly, the movement subtle but enough to break the stillness, and his eyes moved from her to the table, then back again, as if trying to align two versions of reality that no longer matched. Where have you seen it before? He asked, his voice lower now, not demanding, not skeptical, but precise, the kind of question that expected an answer with weight behind it. Maya did not look away, her expression steady, but there was a slight pause this time, not out of uncertainty, but out of decision, as if she were choosing how much of the truth to place into the room. At a firm that used similar structures, she said finally, her tone even, measured. I worked in contract risk analysis for about 3 years. The words landed quietly, but their impact was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable, and Richard's gaze sharpened slightly, not in disbelief, but in recalculation, as if a new variable had just been introduced into an equation he thought he understood. Risk analysis, he repeated, almost to himself, testing the phrase. And then he let out a slow breath, not frustration, but something closer to realization. And now you are here, he added, his eyes briefly dropping to the mop, the bucket, the gloves, the visible markers of a role that no longer aligned with what he had just heard. Maya followed his glance for a fraction of a second, then back to him, her voice calm, unaffected. Yes, sir. Right now I am here. There was no explanation attached to it, no justification, just a statement of fact. And that simplicity carried more weight than any detailed story could have, because it left the question hanging, unanswered but understood. Richard's posture shifted again, not outwardly dramatic, but internally adjusted, as if the framework he used to assess people had just been challenged in a way he could not ignore. He walked back toward the table, his steps measured, and rested his hand once more on the folder, not to reopen it, but to anchor himself in the reality of what had almost happened. Then he looked back at her, fully this time, without the distance that had defined their earlier exchange. You understood the risk before anyone else in this room did, he said, not as praise, not as accusation, but as a statement that needed to be acknowledged. Maya did not react to it, did not shift, did not soften. She simply held his gaze, her presence steady, grounded, as if the recognition did not change who she was, only how she was being seen. The air between them settled into something quieter, something more balanced, and in that moment, the difference between them was no longer defined by position or title, but by awareness, by what had been seen and what had been overlooked, and Richard could feel it clearly now. The subtle but irreversible shift that had taken place, not in the room, not in the deal, but in the way he understood the person standing in front of him. and that understanding was not complete yet, but it was enough to change what came next. Richard remained still for a moment longer, his hand resting on the folder as if it now represented more than just a document, as if it had become a quiet reminder of how close he had come to making a decision based on assumption rather than understanding, and that realization did not sit lightly with him. The room, though mostly empty now, still carried the faint echo of the earlier tension, the polished surfaces reflecting a version of the moment that no longer existed, and in that reflection, he saw the sequence again, the interruption, the doubt, the pause, and the correction that had followed, all of it tracing back to the person standing in front of him. He took a slow breath, then moved around the table, not hurried, not uncertain, but deliberate, each step measured as if he were adjusting to a different pace, one that required attention rather than control. When he stopped a few feet from Maya, the distance between them no longer felt defined by hierarchy, but by something more neutral, more human, and for a second, neither of them spoke. "If you had not said anything," he began, his voice lower now, less formal, "this would have gone through exactly as planned." And the statement was not hypothetical, it was factual, grounded in the process that had already been set in motion. Maya did not respond immediately, not because she disagreed, but because the outcome was already understood, and after a brief pause, she nodded once, acknowledging the truth without adding to it. Richard glanced toward the windows, the city beyond them stretching out in sharp lines and distant motion, a reminder of scale, of consequence, and then back to her, his expression thoughtful, not guarded, not defensive, but open in a way that suggested he was no longer evaluating her position, he was reconsidering his own. "Do you know what that would have cost?" he asked, not expecting an exact figure, but something deeper, something that extended beyond numbers. Maya held his gaze, her voice steady. "More than the deal was worth, sir, not just financially, but structurally. It would have shifted control in ways that are difficult to recover from." Her answer came without hesitation, not rehearsed, not embellished, just clear, and it aligned with the weight he had already begun to feel, confirming what he had only partially formed in his own mind. Richard nodded slowly, the movement small but meaningful, and for a moment, he looked down at his own hands, as if grounding himself in the fact that the decision had not been made, that the outcome had been altered, that the mistake had been avoided. When he looked back up, there was something different in his expression, not just recognition, but responsibility, the kind that comes after understanding what almost happened. "You stepped in when no one else did," he said, and this time the words carried acknowledgement, not as a formality, but as a realization that had settled fully into place. Maya did not shift under the statement, did not respond with pride or deflection. She simply stood there, present, her posture unchanged, as if the acknowledgement did not redefine her, it only clarified the moment. The air between them remained quiet, but it was no longer uncertain. It held a kind of balance that had not existed before. And in that stillness, Richard understood something he had not considered at the start of the day, that value does not always present itself in expected forms, and that overlooking it can cost more than any contract ever could. And as that thought settled in, he realized that what came next would not be about correcting a document. It would be about deciding what to do with the truth that had just been revealed in front of him. Richard did not speak again right away, and this time the silence was not about tension or uncertainty. It was about choice, about what kind of man he was going to be in the next few minutes. Because the decision in front of him was no longer about a contract. It was about how he responded to the truth standing in front of him, unpolished, unannounced, and impossible to ignore. He turned slightly, walking back toward the table, his fingers brushing lightly across the surface as if tracing the outline of what had almost happened. And then he stopped, resting both hands on the edge, looking down for a brief second before lifting his gaze again, not at the city, not at the empty chairs, but at Maya. "You said you worked in risk analysis," he began, his tone steady, but carrying something more grounded now, less distant. 3 years is not entry-level work. Maya remained still, her posture unchanged, her hands relaxed at her sides, the damp cloth now forgotten in her grip. "No, sir," she replied simply, and the absence of explanation again made the space between them feel more honest, not filled with justification, but with reality. Richard nodded once, absorbing that, then glanced briefly at the door where the last of his team had exited, as if acknowledging that the people who were supposed to catch the problem had already left the room, and the one who did had been standing there the entire time, unnoticed. "Why are you not doing that now?" he asked, and this time the question was not sharp, it was careful, aware that the answer might not be simple, aware that it might reveal something he had not considered. Maya's eyes shifted for a fraction of a second, not away, but inward, as if passing through a memory she did not need to fully explain. "Because life does not always move in straight lines," she said quietly, her voice even, but carrying a depth that did not need detail to be understood. "Sometimes you take the work that is available, and you keep going." Richard held her gaze, and for a moment, the weight of that statement settled into him more heavily than anything else she had said, because it stripped away the distance he had placed between roles and reality, between titles and circumstances, and replaced it with something far more direct, far more human. He exhaled slowly, then straightened, his posture no longer just composed, but intentional, as if he had reached a point where observation was no longer enough. "Maya," he said, and this time her name carried a different tone, not as a question, not as a test, but as recognition. "What you did today was not small, it was not incidental, it changed the outcome of this entire situation." She did not react outwardly, but there was a stillness in her that acknowledged the words without needing to respond to them, and that restraint only made them land more firmly in the space between them. Richard stepped slightly closer, not invading her space, but closing the distance just enough to remove the last trace of formality that had separated them earlier. "I am not interested in pretending that this did not happen," he continued, his voice calm, but clear. "And I am not interested in letting it end with you going back to cleaning this floor as if nothing changed." The statement settled in the room, quiet but decisive, and for the first time since the moment began, there was a visible shift in Maya's expression, not surprise, not disbelief, but something more subtle, a recognition that the direction of the conversation had moved beyond acknowledgement and into consequence. Richard held her gaze, steady, certain now. "So here is what I am going to do," he said, and the words did not rush. They arrived with intention, shaping what would come next before it was even fully spoken. And in that moment, the balance that had been shifting quietly between them reached a point where it could no longer return to what it had been before. Richard let the silence sit for a moment after his words, not to create tension, but to give them weight, because what he was about to say was not a reaction, it was a decision, and decisions like this were not made lightly, not in rooms like this, not in lives like his. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out his phone, not hurried, not distracted, but purposeful, and as he unlocked it, the faint glow of the screen reflected briefly across the polished table before he turned slightly away, placing a short call with only a few quiet words. "I need human resources in the executive conference room, now." And then he ended it without explanation, without elaboration, as if the request alone carried enough clarity. Maya watched without shifting, her posture still grounded, her hands relaxed at her sides, and for a brief moment, the room felt suspended again, not uncertain, but waiting for something to take shape. Richard slipped the phone back into his pocket and stepped closer, his attention returning fully to her, no longer divided between her and the situation, but focused entirely on what stood in front of him. "I am offering you a position," he said, his voice calm, direct, without performance. "Not as a favor, not as a gesture, but because you have already demonstrated the skill required for it." The words landed clean, without hesitation, and the room seemed to absorb them in a quiet echo, the marble, the glass, the stillness, all holding that moment in place. Maya did not respond immediately, not out of disbelief, but because she understood what was being said, and more importantly, what it meant, and for a second, her gaze shifted slightly, not away from him, but inward, measuring the distance between where she stood and what was being offered. "You will be evaluated properly," Richard continued, steady, deliberate, "your experience, your capability, all of it, through the same process anyone else would go through, but you will not be overlooked again, not." Here, there was no condescension in his tone, No attempt to soften the statement, just clarity, and that clarity carried respect in a way that did not need to be emphasized. Maya's fingers tightened slightly around the cloth, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to feel it, grounding her in the moment. And when she finally spoke, her voice was as steady as it had been from the beginning. Why? The question was simple, but it did not challenge him. It asked for truth, the same kind she had offered without hesitation. Richard held her gaze, not surprised by the question, not defensive, just present. Because you saw something that should have been seen, he said. And you chose to speak when it would have been easier not to. That matters more to me than where you were standing when you did it. The answer did not come with embellishment. It did not need it. And the space between them settled into something quieter, something more balanced than it had been at any point before. Footsteps approached from the hallway outside, faint at first, then clearer, signaling the arrival of the next part of what he had set in motion. But neither of them turned toward the sound right away, because the moment between them had not finished forming yet. Maya looked at him for a second longer, her expression composed, her presence unchanged, and then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not acceptance, not refusal, but acknowledgement, as if to say she understood the weight of what had just been placed in front of her, and that understanding alone was enough to carry the moment forward into whatever came next. The sound of the door opening was soft, controlled, but it carried enough presence to mark a transition, and both of them turned slightly as a woman in a tailored navy suit stepped into the room, her posture upright, her expression composed, the kind of quiet authority that did not need introduction. She paused just inside the doorway, taking in the scene with a single glance, the empty chairs, the closed folder, the cleaner standing where she was not expected to be, and Richard positioned not behind the table, but beside it. You asked for human resources, she said, her voice even, professional, and Richard nodded once, his attention steady. Yes. Thank you for coming on short notice. He gestured slightly toward Maya, not with a sweeping motion, but with intention, as if placing her within the structure of the conversation rather than outside it. This is Maya Carter, he said, and the way he spoke her name now carried clarity, not introduction, not explanation, just recognition. The woman's gaze shifted to Maya, measured, observant, not dismissive, and she gave a small nod in acknowledgement. Good morning, Maya, she said, her tone neutral but respectful. Maya returned the nod, her posture unchanged, her presence still grounded in the same quiet steadiness that had carried her through the entire exchange. Richard continued without pause, his voice calm, but precise. Maya identified a structural risk in a contract that our team did not catch, a critical one, and she did so with clarity and accuracy under pressure. The statement was not exaggerated, not dramatized, it was delivered as fact, and that fact settled into the room with a weight that did not need reinforcement. The human resources director's expression shifted slightly, not surprise, but interest, the kind that comes when something does not align with expectation, and she stepped a little closer, her attention now fully engaged. I see, she said, her eyes moving briefly between them before returning to Maya. Richard did not wait for further questions. I want her evaluated for a role within contract risk or compliance, immediately, he added, and the word immediately did not carry urgency. It carried priority. The woman nodded slowly, processing, then turned fully toward Maya, her tone still composed, but more focused now. We can arrange an assessment today, if you are available, she said, and the offer was presented not as an exception, but as a step in a process that had simply begun earlier than expected. Maya listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, and for a moment, the room held that same quiet balance again, the shift from where she had been to where she might be now unfolding without noise, without spectacle. She glanced briefly at the mop beside her, the bucket, the simple tools that had defined her place in this building until a few minutes ago, and then back at them, her expression calm, unchanged, but carrying awareness of the transition taking shape. I am available, she said, her voice even, and there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, just a clear acceptance of the opportunity to be seen for what she already was. The human resources director nodded once more, already turning slightly, as if mapping out the next steps in her mind, while Richard remained still, watching, not with control, not with expectation, but with a quiet understanding that the moment had moved beyond him now, that what had started as a correction had become something else entirely, something that would continue forward on its own. And as Maya stepped away from the mop for the first time since she entered the room, the space she left behind did not feel empty. It felt changed, as if the floor itself had absorbed the weight of what had just happened and would never quite reflect the same way again. The hallway outside the conference room felt cooler, quieter, the kind of quiet that carried forward after something significant had already happened, and as Maya stepped through the doorway alongside the human resources director, the soft sound of her shoes against the polished floor echoed just slightly differently than before, not louder, not heavier, just more present, behind her. The conference room door closed with a gentle click, sealing off the moment that had changed everything, but not erasing it, not diminishing it, just placing it in the past where it could no longer be undone. The director walked at a steady pace, her posture confident, her movements efficient, but not rushed, and every few steps she glanced at Maya, not in judgment, but in quiet assessment, as if confirming what she had already been told without needing to question it directly. "We will start with a brief evaluation," she said, her voice calm, professional, nothing formal yet, just enough to understand your familiarity with contract structures and risk distribution. Maya nodded once, her expression composed, her pace matching the woman beside her, and though the environment had shifted, the steadiness in her remained unchanged, grounded in something deeper than circumstance. They passed rows of glass offices, the reflections of desks, screens, and distant movement sliding across the walls like fragments of another world, one that had always existed just out of reach, and yet now felt closer, not because it had changed, but because she had stepped into it in a way she had not been allowed to before. Inside the conference room, Richard remained where he was for a moment longer after they left, his gaze resting on the empty space where Maya had been standing, and in that space, the memory of the earlier moment lingered, the cloth that never touched his shoe, the sentence that had stopped his decision, the clarity that had cut through everything he thought he understood. He walked slowly back to the table, his hand brushing against the folder again, not to open it, but to acknowledge it, to recognize what it had almost represented, and as he stood there, the room no longer felt like a place of control. It felt like a place of learning, of correction, of something quieter and more lasting than authority. He glanced toward the corner where the mop and bucket still stood, untouched, left behind not as abandoned tools, but as a reminder of where the moment had begun, and for a brief second, the contrast settled into him fully, not as discomfort, but as clarity. The understanding that value does not announce itself, it reveals itself. When given the chance, down the hallway, Maya slowed slightly as they approached a smaller office, the director opening the door and stepping aside to let her enter first, a small gesture, but one that carried acknowledgement in a way that did not need to be spoken. Maya stepped inside, her posture steady, her presence unchanged, but the air around her felt different now, not because she had become someone else, but because the world around her had finally adjusted to who she already was, and as the door closed behind them, the quiet shift that had begun in the conference room continued forward, not loud, not dramatic, but certain, shaping what would come next in ways that could no longer be ignored. The office was smaller than the conference room, quieter too, the kind of quiet that did not carry pressure but focus, and as Maya sat across from the human resources director, the faint hum of the building settled into the background like a steady rhythm, something constant, something reliable. The desk between them was clean, organized, a single laptop open, a notepad placed neatly beside it, and as the director took her seat, she looked at Maya not with curiosity anymore, but with attention, the kind that comes when a story has already proven itself and now only needs to be understood. "Let us begin with something simple," she said, her voice calm, measured. "Tell me how you would identify a hidden liability shift in a standard merger agreement." The question was direct, but not intimidating, and Maya did not rush to answer. She took a small breath, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, and then she spoke, her words clear, structured. I would start by comparing the language used in the liability clauses against industry norms, not just the surface wording, but the intent behind it, looking for asymmetry in how responsibility is distributed, especially in conditional statements that appear neutral but carry disproportionate impact. The director listened without interruption, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk, and as Maya continued, the explanation flowed naturally, not rehearsed, not forced, but precise, layered with understanding that did not need to be proven, only expressed. Outside the office, the hallway remained active, distant footsteps, muted voices, the everyday movement of a place that had no idea something had shifted inside it. And yet inside this room, the shift continued to take shape, quietly, steadily. Back in the conference room, Richard stood by the window now, the city stretching out in front of him, the glass reflecting a faint outline of his figure, and for a moment, he did not see the skyline. He saw the reflection of earlier, the stillness, the interruption, the moment his certainty had paused. His hand rested lightly against the glass, not pressed, just there, grounding him in the present, and in that reflection, he saw the version of himself who had spoken without looking, who had assumed without questioning, and the version now, standing still, reconsidering not just the decision he had almost made, but the way he had moved through the moment. He turned slightly, his gaze shifting toward the corner where the mop and bucket still stood, untouched, and for a brief second, the image settled into him, not as something insignificant, but as something defining, a reminder that clarity does not depend on position, and that the truth had come from a place he had almost dismissed entirely. In the office, Maya finished her explanation, her voice steady, her final words resting in the space between them, and the director gave a small nod, not exaggerated, not performative, just enough to acknowledge what she had heard. And as she closed the notepad in front of her, the soft sound marked the end of the first step, not the conclusion, but the beginning. Maya remained seated for a moment longer, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her breathing even, her presence unchanged, and in that stillness, the journey from the conference room to this office did not feel like a leap. It felt like a continuation, a path that had been there all along, waiting to be recognized. And somewhere behind closed doors, on a polished floor that still reflected the light in clean, quiet lines, the place where she had once stood as someone unseen remained exactly as it was. But it no longer meant the same thing, because the moment that had happened there had already moved forward, carried not by noise or spectacle, but by a single choice to speak and a single choice to listen, and that was enough to change everything.